Hello and welcome back. In our last lecture, we discussed the growing tensions that created the environment leading the English colonies to declare themselves independent. Increased taxes were an issue, but we also need to understand the broad frustrations and violence that intensified throughout the 18th century. In our lecture today, we will focus on the final steps leading to the Declaration of Independence and contrast that movement with the one leading to the construction of the U.S. Constitution. We will cover two main issues. The first is an outline of the contrast between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The second is an overview of the nature of the Constitution. So let's get started. The first thing to keep in mind is that the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution had very different purposes. The Declaration was a statement of principle and purpose. Its principle came from the Enlightenment. Its purpose was to break England's authority to rule its citizens in the American continent. Let's take a look at this excerpt from the Declaration of Independence and see how it is a strong reflection of the Enlightenment. First, recall that the Enlightenment argued that God gave all humans one big gift, reason. With reason, humans had freedom of action. But with freedom came responsibility. Okay, let's read the excerpt. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted by men, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. Now let's interpret this. All men are created equal. This corresponds with the Enlightenment idea that God gave all humans the same gift, reason. This also means that God did not give any one person preference over another. Thus, all humans had the same rights. In the wording of the Declaration, they list some of the main rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The next section says that governments are created by humans to defend their rights. Government's legitimacy comes from the people who created it. And if the government becomes abusive to people's rights, they are to change it or to get rid of it. The key point is that there is nothing sacred about government. Instead, it is the people's rights that are sacred. Now let's contrast the Declaration of Independence with the Constitution. The first thing to keep in mind regarding the Constitution is that it was written 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. Thus, its principle and purpose was very different. Its purpose was to write an effective governing contract among the states and territories that had been won at the conclusion of the War of Independence. Its principle is much harder to nail down. What we see is that the Constitution is a reflection of competing principles. To detail this, let's read excerpts from some of the more conservative delegates at the Constitutional Convention. Edmund Rudolph. The evils from which the country suffers originated in the turbulence and follies of democracy. William Livingston. The people have never been and ever will be unfit to retain the exercise of power in their hands. Alexander Hamilton. A permanent governmental body should check the imprudence of democracy. The words of these delegates may sound shocking. Each one questions whether democracy is a good idea. Edmund Rudolph's reference was a concern about intense infighting in states and between states. After the British left, fighting did not end, but instead of fighting England, we were fighting ourselves. William Livingston's statement directly challenges the idea that democracy can work. In his view, common people have no direct place in government. He questioned the common person's intelligence and their motives. Alexander Hamilton is the most generous of these delegates. He believes that an element of democracy could be included, but it should be limited and managed. The principles of these delegates contrasted with those who had a more positive view of democracy. The key point is the U.S. Constitution is a mixture of principles. We will detail how the principles influence the Constitution a little later. But at this point, let's turn to the events that led to the Declaration of Independence. As we noted at the beginning of this lecture, there was growing frustration building throughout the 18th century. The last big event before the American Revolution was the 7 Years' War. England was the victor, but the cost of war led them to increase taxes so they could pay their debt. Additionally, small farmers who joined the British military were angry because they felt that England had not fulfilled their promise to pay them with 80 acres of land. With these things in mind, let's take a closer look at the taxes England set. Between 1764 and 1774, England imposed 4 new taxes aimed at raising revenue. These included taxes on sugar, stamps, and tea. As noted earlier, England needed to raise revenue to pay the costs of war. Additionally, the colonies had much lower taxes than England proper, so they seemed to be the logical candidate for taxes. Lastly, the role of colonies was to enrich the mother country. In total, England felt that the taxes were justified and fair. But in addition to raising revenue, England sought to regain control of their colonies. When the royal government wrote charters establishing the colonies, they allowed them a measure of self-government. This was largely out of practicality, considering that it took anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Throughout the 1700s, England struggled to control trade in its colonies. Many merchants, especially those of the North, traded illegally in the Caribbean. In so doing, they also evaded taxes. This brings us to the second set of events leading to independence: coercion. To coerce means to force. England was trying to force the colonies to behave properly. This meant paying their taxes, as well as submitting to the authority of the crown. For the most part, it felt it could control its colonies. The exception were the northern colonies, especially Massachusetts. As a result, England wrote a series of new laws aimed at controlling Massachusetts, with special attention on Boston. These laws were called the Coercive Acts. These new laws closed the port of Boston, annulled Massachusetts' charter, thus removing their right to self-govern, housed soldiers in people's homes, and removed people's right to trial in the local community. Where the goal was to control Massachusetts, the outcome was fear in other colonies. They felt that their right to self-govern would soon be revoked. The words of a Minuteman provide a good picture of how the Coercive Acts ignited the independence movement. In 1843, almost 60 years after the war, Levi Preston, a former Minuteman, was interviewed. He said that taxes did not affect him because he did not do any transactions or consume goods that were taxed. When asked what he fought for, he said, "We always governed ourselves and always meant to. The details of the law I'm not clear on, but the idea of government I have always been sure of." The first battle for independence was fought in Lexington, Connecticut in April of 1775. It took a little over a year for the rest of the colonies to join, and on July 4th, 1776, independence was officially declared. So let's now see how independence pushed government leaders towards the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation was our country's first governing document. This was a formal agreement among all the colonies who had declared their independence from England. Some things to keep in mind are that these former colonies, now states, were separated by great distance. Additionally, there was a great deal of cultural and economic variation. Recall that England had populated its colonies with many European groups. Due to these factors, the Articles of Confederation were purposely designed to leave most political power and control in the hands of state leaders. This governing system sought to organize resistance during war. Its biggest achievement was to hold the states together during the war. Its diplomats successfully concluded a peace treaty with England, giving the new nation control over territories that were much bigger than the original colonies. The new nation was bigger than any European nation of the time. A second major achievement was that it set up a system for incorporating new territories into the country. But its weaknesses became clear after independence. To understand its weaknesses, we need to look at the traditional definition of a state. In political terms, a state is a sovereign or independent nation. Most often in our country today, we think of states as simply a part of the broader nation. But the Articles of Confederation were written with the traditional term in mind. One of the goals of the Confederation was to unify a collection of independent societies enough so they could stand up to the most powerful kingdom of the time, England. A second, almost contradictory goal was to allow each independent society to function as a nation. In a very real sense, the early U.S. functioned like the United Nations does today. With this in mind, we can better understand the Confederation's weaknesses. So what were they? First, Congress could not levy or collect taxes. This made them dependent on the good or bad will of states. Second, Congress could not regulate trade. Third, Congress could not force any state to abide by the laws of the Confederation. Fourth, all states had to agree in order to amend the Confederation. 5. There was no national court system, so laws were interpreted from the interest of each independent state. The overall result was national chaos after peace was settled with England in 1783. So let's now turn to some of the major elements of chaos. Keep in mind what we said about the traditional meaning of state. Directly after the war, the new nation seemed to be anything but united. In economic terms, each state acted as an independent nation. New York, which sat at the crossroads of the North and the South, charged import and export taxes on goods passing through from one to another state. Pennsylvania used its militia to remove settlers from Connecticut who were trying to occupy its western regions. New England states criticized southern states for using slave labor, but were most angry about the Southerners using English traders to sell their goods in the Caribbean. Southerners were fearful of Northern shippers creating a monopoly and felt that England was a more reliable and honest trading partner. Directly related to economic tensions, a number of states and territories had people considering secession, meaning they were considering leaving the new nation and accepting either Spain or England as their sovereign. For example, Spain was lobbying people in Kentucky to break away. In return, they would gain access to New Orleans. New Orleans had been closed to the United States. In practice, this meant that major American rivers could not be used for transportation. In Vermont, there were open negotiations with London to rejoin the British Empire. While all these issues caused fear and infighting, the most troublesome event pushing leaders away from the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion. The outbreak of rebellion occurred in Massachusetts in 1786. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran. Using the language of the Declaration of Independence as justification, he led an armed rebellion saying that Massachusetts state government was denying freedom of its citizens through excessive taxes that forced small farmers into bankruptcy. To leaders of state governments, it appeared that a new revolution was on its way. Added to all the other elements of fragmentation, state leaders felt that they had no choice but to transform their governmental structures or completely fall apart. In the wake of Shays' Rebellion, states felt compelled to address the weaknesses of the Articles. A convention was arranged for 1787. The goal was not to write a new constitution, but to clean up the Articles of Confederation. But as the meeting began, it became clear that fundamental transformation was needed. Broad discussions soon led to the idea of writing a constitution. Each state already had their own constitutions. The question became whether a national constitution could be agreed on. One category of discussion was about political participation. Republicanism was a central issue in this regard. The term simply means representative government. There are three forms of republicanism that were debated. The first form is called classical republicanism. It used ancient Rome as its model. The Roman Republic was governed by a body called the Senate. In the Senate, the 100 most powerful families represented the interests of the Republic. Those at the Constitutional Convention who argued for this form of republicanism saw the United States as modern-day Rome. They argued that aristocrats of the nation were the natural leaders. These individuals had experience in governing their own estates, they had education, and thus had the ability and skills to govern. But the most important trait that they had was disinterest. This means that they had no interest in empowering themselves because they already had wealth and power. Thus, they would be honest brokers. A second form of republicanism was called rational self-interest. It did not believe that aristocrats were actually disinterested. Instead, it argued that all people are self-interested, meaning that everybody has an interest in promoting their own cause. What it sought to do was set up a competitive environment where people were encouraged to look out for their own interest. For this to work, fair competition was needed. Monopoly in politics and business was the main thing to avoid. The third form of republicanism was called radical republicanism, or direct democracy. It argued that all people did have the ability to govern. Education itself did not define intelligence. Common farmers and small shopkeepers had a right to participate because they had a direct connection to the effects of the laws. Where republicanism debated representation in government, liberalism focused on where government power should reside. The name comes from liberation and freedom. It was the most modern political theory of its time. It feared central government because it was distant and decisions and laws were removed from those who would feel their impact. Beyond that, it felt that government had a natural inclination to take more power. Controlling government locally, meaning at the state level, was the best way to limit governmental power and providing laws that were appropriate to local conditions. In contrast with liberalism, federalism argued that the key thing the nation needed was strong central government. Leaving power at the local level would not solve the infighting among states. Without a strong central government, we could never function as a unified nation. The result would be secession of states from the Union. European powers would reestablish control and overwhelm the new nation. So let's now turn and see how these competing principles were negotiated in our governing contract, the Constitution. When considering the nature of the U.S. Constitution, it is important to recognize that it embodies competing and, at times, contradictory principles. It is best understood as a compromise document. Political leaders had to negotiate the interests of local control with federal control, as well as the interests of aristocrats, small business, and farmers. We will see that the arguments of the Federalists won on issues related to domestic economic interests and foreign policy. The federal government was given sole authority to set domestic economic rules. No state could set up import taxes from other states. No state could print or distribute money. No state could write or accept treaties with foreign governments. The federal government held all these rights, but it was also limited in its authority. This is referred to as enumerated powers. It means that the federal government only has power in the specific areas listed or numbered in the Constitution. This is easier to understand if we describe states' rights. States' rights mean that individual states can make any law as long as it does not infringe on one of the enumerated rights given to the federal government and does not contradict the Constitution. It is noteworthy that the rights of people were not included in the original Constitution. Instead, the Constitution had agreed on the powers of the federal government and state governments. Limitation of governmental power did not focus on individual freedoms. The Constitution was printed and sent out for ratification, and it was at that point when the public began to react. The Bill of Rights were written as amendments to the Constitution. These rights limit the power of state and federal governments. That the Bill of Rights were an afterthought seems odd, but in the view of governments of the time, it was believed that people's rights were implicit. England had functioned as a society that practiced individual rights. So it was believed that individual rights did not need to be specified in a constitution. Nevertheless, it became clear that without these rights included, the Constitution would not be ratified. The last topic we will cover in this lecture relates to key compromises that were to set the stage for the Civil War 70 years later. Both have to do with slavery. The 3/5 compromise established the value of a slave for the purposes of representation in Congress. The Senate has 2 representatives per state and provides each state, regardless of size, an equal vote. But representation in the House of Representatives is based on population. Large states have more votes. The question arose, since slaves are not free, should they count as part of the population that establishes representation? The North, that did not have slaves, said no, they should not count. The South said yes. The compromise was that a slave would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of establishing representation in the House of Representatives. Regarding slave trade, Southerners agreed to accept a ban on international slave trade for 20 years. But it also did not allow any amendment that challenged slavery for the same time period. The North felt that if it did not make concessions to the South, the Constitution would not be ratified. It was also believed that slavery as a labor system was nearing its end. But another reason for the compromise was that neither the North nor South envisioned a country with a large body of free black people. So slavery as an issue was mostly put aside, with the hopes of a future resolution. We will come back to this topic when we look at the pressures leading to the Civil War. But for now, we will leave this lecture. Please come to class with your notes on this lecture and be ready for a discussion. See you then.